Welcome back to another episode of Pet Squares, episode 11, and we're going to be departing from the format of the show for this episode. Up until now, we've been looking at the history of the Beach Boys through the prism of how it developed through their recording career and looking at each album and what was going on at the time. But in going through the band's history chronologically, we've reached a point of crisis, and that is the December 1964 nervous breakdown of their leader, Brian Wilson. This basically was the moment that set the future course of the band for decades and took us away from the whole five guys in striped shirts smiling and singing about surfing, and made the whole band's history much more complicated. I wanted to sit down and look at this event in some depth, and most particularly with some context. Brian's story and his battle with mental illness has become a key part of the band's mythology. It's become a key part of music history. It's something that's been widely reported on, but we tend to look at it through the prism of how we see mental illness these days, or how we saw mental illness in the 70s and 80s. We look at it through the prism of his childhood abuse, his drug abuse, the chemical precursors to mental illness. We look at it from our vantage point back. But there's a key part of this that I think we really need to respect and understand, and that's left out of this discussion, and that is the events that led up to Brian's breakdown, and how even those of us that did not have abusive parents, did not have a chemical predisposition to mental illness, did not have Brian's quirky, sensitive personality, were we put in the position that Brian was, we may well have had our own breakdowns, because he was under an impossible amount of strain, time pressure, physical stress, emotional stress. And so I wanted to do this special episode to go back and look at the chronology of the things that built up to what happened to Brian, and get a fuller understanding of just how much environmental factors must have played a role in forming Brian's future path. So in making this show, I want to credit a few people that were invaluable. I had several consultations with Andrew Doe, Beach Boys historian, and I relied heavily on his Bellagio 10452 website, the timeline they're in, and both his research and that of Beach Boys historian Ian Rustin. And also I had some very productive conversations with Peter Ames Carlin, who wrote Catch a Wave, biography of Brian and the Beach Boys. So without all these people, I would not have been able to get my questions answered and collect my thoughts, and so I want to credit them with helping on this episode. So where did this all start? Well, we know that Brian had a rough childhood, that Murray Wilson was abusive. Brian is the eldest son, was sort of the vessel for all of Murray's frustrations in life and his frustrated musical ambitions. Brian had a lot of expectations to fulfill, and Murray was certainly a very forceful motivator, and probably created a sort of hypersensitivity in Brian, just having this very noisy person constantly on his back, having him try to excel, not really cutting him too much slack in anything. But that being said, Brian does not seem to have had symptoms of mental illness per se as a child. His high school friends remember that he was a quirky guy. He would sometimes laugh in strange places, like he still does, but that he was also a born leader, especially with anything relating to music. So a lot of those personality traits that were quirky but not crazy, if we can use that term, were there with Brian, but he was not what we would call mentally ill at that point, at least not in terms of what he exhibited to the outside world. And indeed, mental illness, such as Brian's, often manifests at about age 22, 23, which is the time period we're talking about. So this isn't surprising. But I do want to go from there now to walk through Brian's evolution as a Beach Boy and how the growth of the band went down. Because if you remember, the Beach Boys started out as just some sort of vague manifestation of Brian's musical ambitions. And you had as you will repeatedly see throughout the Beach Boys' history, people around him that catalyzed his desires. You had Mike, who wanted to get out of sort of a dead-end job situation. He wanted to hustle and make something better out of his life. You had Dennis, who just sort of wandered in and said, you should do a song about surfing. You had, for better or for worse, Murray, without whom the band would have never got its first recording session, never would have gotten a recording contract, never would have been able to run interference for Brian to get the permission to self-produce and work with Chuck Britz. As much of a negative force as Murray was, we would not have the Beach Boys without him, you know. So you have Brian from the very beginning having this duality where he's the leader, he's making things happen, he's the guy that's writing the songs, he's the guy that's, you know, the main creative force. But you have these other people around him that sort of provide the framework for those ambitions to advance. You know, you've got guys that are a little more type A in areas outside of music that see what Brian's got and they want to get on that bus and they want to help keep that bus moving. And those tend to be some of the people that we look at as villains in the story. And there's an aspect of that, certainly with Murray, and some other people that will come later, you know, like Gene Landy, or, you know, I'm not going to get into other names, but those people were there to catalyze an ambition in Brian, give it a direction. So what we're going to see is, even though Brian is directing the band and he's the guy that's pushing things forward, he's also, to some extent, from the very beginning, being carried along by events that are external to him. But in the beginning, this isn't a big problem, because when the band starts in '62, they're not doing a lot of heavy touring. They play a lot, but it's mostly in the Southern California area and surrounding areas, doing what Murray and Audrey Wilson called the 40 freebies. In other words, they would do these local concerts, sock hops, high school dances, things like that, for local DJs who would then, in kind of a soft payola arrangement, play the band's records, which in turn drove their airplay nationwide. So it was a key part in their early success with the early album Surf and Safari and early singles. Brian at that time was pretty much a full-time band member, you know, and he was making all the shows, but it wasn't an unreasonable workload, because they only had one album in '62, Surf and Safari. He's still getting to do a lot of his outside projects, you know, that are fun for him, like the Bob and Sherry record and things like that, Rachel and the Revolvers. And the shows aren't that taxing. I mean, you know, I'm sure, you know, he had to learn the bass, and they had Murray Ride and Hurd on him all the time, and they're all cramped in a station wagon riding to gigs. I'm sure it wasn't fun, but it wasn't a ridiculous amount of work. Now, the really heavy touring for the band starts in '63, and that's where they go from being, you know, kind of a hot regional band with a hit or two to basically the biggest band in the U.S. And an interesting thing happens as soon as the band starts doing heavy touring. Brian calls up Al Jardine and says, hey, you want to come play bass? I mean, the band does two major tours in '63 in the middle of the year, and Brian either doesn't make them at all or starts them and bails very quickly. He's still leading the recording dates, he's still doing the TV appearances, he's still doing the local performances, he's still doing the key road shows, but everything else, very quickly, he gives it to Al Jardine. So he's hardly on the road in '63 in a meaningful way until October. And Murray definitely wasn't happy about this. Now, I don't know exactly how Brian got away with this, but the upshot of it was Brian's '63, again, was a fairly reasonable schedule based on you know, a balance of the things that Brian liked to do. He's producing outside of the People. He had a decent amount of time at home to work on the albums, and they did a bunch of albums in '63. How many did they do? They did Surfing USA in January and February. They did the Little Deuce Coupe, and then Surfer Girl. So 3 albums. right, pretty much right on top of each other. So it's a pretty healthy workload. But, Brian can handle that. But then we get a very key event in the fall of '63, and that is the departure of David Marks. Now, they're all on the road, and David and Murray get into it, as they frequently do, and they're all in the car, and David says, well, I'm quitting the band. Nobody else takes this seriously, but David apparently meant it, and Murray wanted David to mean it, because he immediately says, everyone hear that? David says he's quitting the band. Kind of like a kid. You can't do a take back, it's kind of a weird thing for Murray to pounce on, but what that tells me is Murray really wanted David gone, and I don't think he just wanted David gone because he was a pain in the neck for Murray. I think he wanted David gone because he wanted to force Brian back on the road. And that's exactly what happened. And as of October 5th, 1963, Al Jardine is now the new rhythm guitar player, moved over from bass. Brian is back on bass for the live band, and from October '63 to December '64, Brian is a full-time member of the band, and we have the iconic Beach Boys, the guys in the striped shirts, the five guys smiling. That's 14 months out of the band's history. And a very pivotal 14 months, because that's when they become the biggest band in the U.S., and then the Beatles come, and then they withstand the Beatles, and so they've obviously manifested their staying power. They're now in the top echelon of rock acts, and Brian is now in an era when they're finally starting to get on TV and be visually seen by a lot of people. Brian is now front and center, singing lead with Mike on their TV appearances and, on most of the singles. It's him. So Brian is right there. And he's still making the albums, and he's still producing everything, he's still writing most of the songs, and now he's on the road all the frickin' time. So let's go into '64, which is the year where everything goes down. First thing that happens, first 2 weeks of January, they're doing Shutdown Volume 2, which we discussed earlier on this program. Then they go to Australia and New Zealand for their first big overseas tour. There's a whole bunch of shows there, and that's right after Shutdown Volume 2 happens. Then they come back, and they're back to work on Shutdown Volume 2 some more. And then they do a bunch of local shows. March, they're doing some local shows, doing some sessions, so March is pretty chill. And then we get to April, and they're doing All Summer Long again. In April and May, they're doing All Summer Long. So up till now, it's pretty busy. Now, the first sort of notch in our timeline occurs in May, which is when the band was in Texas, May 15th, 16th. Mike Love alleges in his recent biography that during that tour he went into Brian's room when Brian was out and saw drug paraphernalia in his bathroom kit, including a syringe. Now I'm not quite sure what to make of this, because I have a very easy time believing Brian and probably some of the other members of the band were using amphetamines by this point, because that was very common in the early '60s, didn't have the stigma it does now. A lot of people were popping pills, people in the Army, stay awake, truckers, musicians. Anybody with an impossible schedule like this one could see them taking some uppers. I think I've been trying to establish whether this was the case or not. I can't. We know Brian was taking speed in '65, but whether he was taking any kind of drugs this early, I'm surprised to hear about the syringe. We know that the Wilsons indulged in some heroin use in the '70s. It's hard for me to imagine, frankly, a 22-year-old Brian, 21-year-old Brian shooting up anything. It seems a little early in the game for that to me. But, Mike could be misremembering, and he himself admits he doesn't know what kind of drugs were in the bag. But if it was some kind of pills or something, that I find pretty easy to believe. And it's been said of Brian that speed did him more damage than LSD did, and it's easy to see how, especially under these circumstances, how a drug that would speed up your nervous system would, for someone with Brian's anxious personality and under the pressure cooker environment of a rock and roll band touring in the '60s, it's easy to see how speed would make a lot of things worse. But the bottom line is, all we know is Mike says he saw drugs in Brian's dressing room in May '64. I guess it doesn't quite make sense to me, but we can't discount that. I'm not saying Mike lied. He was there, I wasn't. But memories can be a little weird, so not sure what to make of that. But we go into June Now we're doing the Christmas album. So what? That's what, 3 albums already now? 3 albums, 1 national tour, and I'm sorry, 1 international tour and a bunch of regional touring. And then we get to July. And here's where things really get crazy, because they go on this summer safari tour with Jimmy Griffin, Freddie Cannon, Lynn Easton, and the Kingsmen. Let's talk about this tour. They start in July 3rd in Hawaii. July is 31 days. How many shows do they do in July 64? 35. So they're doing more than 1 show a day. And they're, it's a fairly well-routed tour. None of these drives are, I don't know if it's driven or flying, but these aren't unreasonable moves. Indianapolis to Milwaukee, Milwaukee to Flint, Flint to Urbana. Okay, so that's 4 or 5 hours in the car, an hour or 2 in the plane. But still, you're getting on a plane, you're getting off, you're getting on a bus, and you're getting off, and you're playing a show. Maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it's an hour, but every frickin' day. No let up. 35 shows in July. Then, August. First thing we do, live album in Sacramento. 2 shows there, but we take a break then? No, we've got 2 more shows the next day in Santa Rosa. Fresno, 2 more shows. And then down to Santa Barbara. Oh, now we're back in Burbank. Hometown, can we rest? No, because on the same day as the show, we have recording session for their new single, When I Grow Up to Be a Man, and She Knows Me Too Well. Break after that? Nope. Straight to Las Vegas after that, then Phoenix. Consecutive days, all told, they do 25 shows, plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 recording sessions. Come on now. 30 days in August. September. Only a slight let up. The touring continues. 21 shows, 3 recording sessions, plus an appearance on Ed Sullivan. Finally, in October, there's a little break. They get to fly home at the end of September, and Brian gets 2 weeks off. And this is a pivotal period because Brian moves out of the home of the Rovels, the family that he's been living with, and he has found some peace and stability in that family environment, and he's also started a romantic relationship with the Rovels' 16-year-old daughter, Marilyn. But at this point, Brian moves into his own place in Hollywood. And it's the first time I think he's had his own place. And it's pretty clear from looking at the timeline and from the testimony of all involved, including Brian, that this is where Brian tries marijuana for the first time, the beginning of October. Now, let me make clear that although I don't really indulge myself, I know a lot of people that smoke pot and it's beneficial for their lives. And I'm not suggesting, that, any kind of reefer madness scenario that, Brian smokes weed and it ruins his life. But there are some people for whom marijuana is not beneficial. And according to friends of Brian's, one was quoted as saying privately, he was the last person that should have tried marijuana, let alone anything else. And it's definitely true that one thing that comes with marijuana use and later hashish, which Brian indulged in quite a bit, is paranoia. And we've already got a pretty anxious guy who's got some very real pressures, some very real heroes and villains in his life. So it does seem like Brian's starting to take marijuana does seem to be the point at which things start to unravel. And I don't think it's only the chemical aspect. I think it's also the fact that Brian finally got 2 weeks to sit at home and chill, smoke a doob, write, and relax. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that Guess I'm Dumb, which is probably the first song of his that clearly points towards where Pet Sounds was going, happens at the end of this 2-week layoff of Brian's. That's where he starts recording Guess I'm Dumb. So Brian gets a taste of what life could be like if he's not on the road all the frickin' time. Just chill out, smoke a doob, write some songs. Whichever is the case, and I think both the medicinal effects of marijuana and the effects of just Brian being able to relax, I think this is the point where the wheels start to come off the wagon. So anyway, we're in October. They do some light touring around California, and culminating in the Tammy Show, which is one of the Beach Boys' most iconic performances and one of their most highly praised performances. This is the peak of the band with Brian on bass, the peak of the classic band, one of the appearances that forms the archetype in our heads of what the Beach Boys were and what they represented in their classic period. But right after the Tammy show is completed, and it was filmed from the 27th to the 29th in the Civic Auditorium in Santa Monica, the band's due to fly to Europe for their first tour. So Brian's had some time off. He's had a whole month in California. He's had to do a bunch of shows, but they're all kind of hometown stuff. But now they're going back on the road. And now we come to what I think is the second pivotal moment. And it's something I haven't seen anybody talk about. Because just prior to their leaving on tour for Europe, probably something they squeezed in because it was close to their airport takeoff location, the band does a show in Worcester, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. That's on October 30th. So it's the night before they take off for England. A riot breaks out at the show. The band goes on and people get out of their seats. A bunch of girls start rushing the stage. Outside, kids are breaking windows trying to get in. After 14 minutes, they stop the show. Police calm them down. Band goes back on. Stage is rushed again. The show gets called off. Now, the band is quoted as saying they wished that they could continue. The kids didn't get their money's worth, blah, blah, blah. But significantly, the person that's quoted is Mike. And it's hard to imagine that Brian, having just come off a couple weeks where he didn't have to tour, then a couple more weeks where things are pretty active, but he's close to home, things manageable. Now he's getting ready to get on a plane to go to Europe and do a whole bunch more stuff. And the first thing that happens is a frickin' riot comes out, and you got all these crazy teenage girls coming up and at him. And I didn't mention this, but it's part of that crazy July tour that I said earlier, where they're doing 35 shows in 31 days. Dennis actually got injured. Someone in the crowd threw something, clocked him in the head, and he was out for 3 days. They had to have the Kingsmen's drummer sub for him. So Brian has already seen this post-Beatlemania insanity of screaming teenagers turn violent once. Now, the first thing that happens when he's going back on the road again is this riot, where they actually have to shut down the show. The next day, they fly to England. And on the way to London, the plane is diverted to Shannon Airport in Ireland, ostensibly because of weather, but apparently Brian suffers a panic attack on this flight. The first one that we know of. Now, was that because the plane had an unscheduled landing somewhere, or was it because he was having to go back out on yet another long tour and he just had experienced a show that probably scared him out of his wits? I think there's no way that the riot at the Worcester show didn't play a role in the chain of events that led to Brian's breakdown. I think it must have. But anyway, we know Brian had a panic attack the next day, and we know that their first appearance, which was on the British TV show Top of the Pops, was canceled. And there's no notation here as to why it was canceled. And it may be in Ian Rustin's book. I don't have access to it, but I have to wonder. Top of the Pops is a pretty big deal. It's not something you would normally cancel. But anyway, the wheels get back on the train, and now the band is touring Europe. And even though it's mostly a promotional tour, and they're doing a lot of TV performances, but in November they do at least 21 shows and TV performances, probably more. And they're in England, France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Denmark. Then, before the month is up, they're back in the States, and they're back touring in the Northeast again. Rochester, New Haven, Cleveland, Detroit. I mean, okay, so now we've had what? July, August, September, and now November. They've been playing almost every damn day and traveling almost every damn day. October was more like 62 was for Brian, a little more manageable, a little closer to home, but they still did what? They still did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They still did a week's worth of shows. So now we get to December. Brian gets home, and finally he's got another 2 weeks off. And the first thing he decides to do is marry Marilyn Rovell. In classic Brian impulsive fashion, at first he runs off with her to Nevada, but does not bring any of the necessary paperwork, and they refuse to marry. The couple, Brian actually has his ID up and goes, "See, this is me," to no avail. Brian and Marilyn are unable to be married, and quite a stressful emotional situation for Marilyn. But they do finally manage to accomplish this on the 7th of December. 22-year-old Brian is married to 16-year-old Marilyn Rovell. And I've actually interacted with Marilyn Wilson Rutherford many times. She's an extraordinary woman. And I don't doubt that she was probably the best partner Brian could have hoped for at the time. You know, I'm sure she was very supportive, very loving. She definitely appreciated Brian's quirky side. She thought he was a lot of fun to be with. She just was totally in love with him. But the fact remains, she was a 16-year-old girl. And I'm attaching no judgment to it. It was a different time. There was parental consent. The age gap was wide, but not ridiculous. You know, I mean, this is, you know, I think it probably was a survival move for Brian to try to establish some stability in his life. But getting married at a young age, under these circumstances, you're touring a rock and roll band, that's stressful. And that gets us right up to the point of Brian's breakdown. Now, the week prior to Brian's breakdown, the band does 2 TV appearances in Los Angeles. And I think these are very interesting. And I usually avoid using any kind of copyrighted material in the show, but I'm going to make an exception, take a little risk under fair use, and look at a few of these clips because I think they tell us a lot about where Brian was at. And it's worth mentioning at this point that the single they are promoting is Dance, 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 and it's one of their most manic songs, and Brian has said that it was a reflection of his mental state at the time. It's a frantic, very short, very fast song. The theme of the song is just dance, dance, dance. There's a sort of desperate, frenetic vibe to it, and this can't be a coincidence that this is what Brian came up with during this summer of relentless touring. And you have to ask, also, again, with speculating about possible drug use before Brian tried marijuana, you know, if you were going to write a song on amphetamines, this is probably a song that you might write. So here's the Shindig appearance, and this is on the 14th. Now, this is the first day back. But he looks tired but reasonably happy. The performance is okay. Brian's not singing that great. He's pretty flat. So again, seems like he might be a little bit fatigued, but he's keeping it. He's, you know, nothing really off here. This is one of the most difficult songs for Brian to sing and play live because of its murderous bass line, and you got that really high vocal going on top of it. So that's December 14th. But then we get to the 18th, and to me, this is a pivotal moment. They do the Bob Hope comedy show. And to me, there's something very off with Brian here. First of all, we don't even see Brian. They keep cutting to Dennis. There he is. Not much on Brian, but you know, he's smiling, but he's looking a little tired. Now watch this body language when they get to the solo. Look how he's kind of hunched over his face. Now look over here, he's kind of going down. It's almost like he's writhing. Now watch this. Let's back up and see that again. To me, that looks like a guy that's trying to muster up some will. Hours after this performance, the band was scheduled to leave on their December tour. Brian refused to go. So the band does the Bob Hope appearance, and in my view, Brian looks like he's struggling there. The very next day, apparently, they are supposed to leave on tour, but Brian won't go. They cancel 2 shows in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and according to the Bellagio 10452 website, this is because of an illness of a member of the band. So apparently, after that show, Brian goes home. He's supposed to get on a plane the next day. He won't go. So the Beach Boys stay in LA, try to coax him to go. Finally, they get him to get on a plane. And that's the day that it all goes down. The day is December 21st. So Brian's finally been convinced to go back on the road with the guys. They're at the airport. I think Brian says something like, I'm really looking forward to all the fun I'm going to have on the road, or all the fun we're going to have on the road. And Marilyn, probably trying to make Brian jealous, says something like, that's great, because I'm going to have a lot of fun while you're gone. And then apparently, either concurrently with that statement or at some other point, Brian thinks that she sees Marilyn exchange romantic glances with Michael Love. Now, I don't think there was anything to this. I think it was just, a teenage Marilyn trying to make her rock star boyfriend, or husband, sorry, a little bit jealous. He's just going off on the road again. Pretty understandable. But what we know is that while on that flight to Texas, Brian completely loses it. Stomach cramps, sobbing, crying, jumping out of his seat. Al Jardine next to him, having no idea what to make of this. Brian demanding to get on the radio to have the pilots contact Marilyn. And look through the prism of all the stuff that we've just talked about. Like, why would Brian have this reaction to what was probably just teenage messing around? I don't think Marilyn was going to have an affair with Mike. Highly doubt it. But Brian's on this treadmill, and his marriage to Marilyn was his attempt to establish some sort of bulwark of stability in his life. And now he's imagining in his stressed out, somewhat paranoid state that might slip away from him. And that's his last little grasp on solid ground. And with him getting on a plane, leaving her for another long tour, I mean, not as long as what he's been on, but another, fairly vigorous tour, you can see how that would just send him right over the edge. So Brian locks himself in this room. His brothers, they don't know what to do. He finally calms down enough to do the show, but then flies home the next day. And Glenn Campbell takes the same plane back with their road manager. Upon arrival back in Los Angeles, Audrey greets Brian at the airport. They go back to the Wilsons' now vacant childhood home in Hawthorne, and they sit in Brian's old room, and Brian just talks to his mom about how tired he is, and just dumps out what he called a lifelong hang-up. And Brian got out of the tour, and it's worth mentioning that at the point of his breakdown, Brian was looking at a tour that was going to consist of 10 more shows in 12 days, ending on the 3rd, and as soon as they were done, on the 7th, they were to be in the studio to start recording their next album, The Beach Boys Today. So with all this other stuff, Brian had to be thinking, how the hell am I going to get this album together? Because I'm going off on yet another tour. And so, again, July, August, September, November, they were playing almost every day and traveling, and recording sessions in the middle, and even on the easy months. It's not like they had a whole month off. They might have a couple days, 2 weeks. They still had sessions, still had shows. This is insane. Even for a 22-year-old guy full of testosterone. I mean, all the guys were tired, but none of them had to come up with the albums. None of them had to deal with as point guy with the record label. That was all Brian. Murray was gone. He wasn't the manager anymore. Brian was the point guy. So Brian had a breakdown, and that breakdown got him out of an impossible situation from which there was really no other escape. And Brian has admitted that this is the point where he realized that he could use the behavior of a mentally ill person to manipulate the people around him into getting what he wanted. Now, this is Brian saying this. And I'm in no way saying that Brian's mental illness is inauthentic, but by Brian's own admission, he also used it as a way to reclaim power over his life and some ability to do the things that he wanted, which he was completely prevented from doing all through 1964. This isn't saying he didn't really have mental illness. He certainly did. He at least had a stress-induced breakdown in 64. And I think clearly by 66, he was suffering from some kind of mental illness. Now, whether that was brought on by drug use or whether the drug use was self-medicating the mental illness, it's impossible to say, and it probably was a little of both. But just as there was a duality in that, while legitimately starting to be taken over by mental illness, Brian was also using the specter of mental illness to manipulate the situation around him so that he could get some peace and freedom to live his life apart from the family and business obligations of the Beach Boys. And this is important to understand because we retrospectively look back on all the people that were around Brian at the time and why didn't they do this, why didn't they do that? Well, we were just idiots about mental illness at the time, and we were, but they also knew Brian quite well, and they knew that at least some of the time Brian was doing this to get his way. And so it became hard for the people around him to know, is this real or not? And it probably delayed treatment for Brian for quite a while because nobody could really be sure whether Brian was playing at being crazy or whether he was really having some serious problems. And almost certainly both. And that would create this difficult dynamic where there was probably less compassion and concern for him than there should have been because there was some question as to how much this was Brian pulling strings. And again, I have to stress, because this is something of a controversial thing to say, I don't want to be misunderstood. Brian has said as much himself. And so I think in looking at what happened with Brian's breakdown, this is one of the reasons I wanted to get so hard into the context, because take away all the other factors, this is an insane workload. And any one of us would have buckled under this pressure. I couldn't have done this. And I've done lots of heavy touring and I've done lots of recording, and I can easily put myself in Brian's shoes and think of what this was like, and this is nuts. You can't put somebody through this kind of ringer, and a lot of 60s people lost their minds for exactly this reason. You're just in this pressure cooker of an environment where you have to produce, new album, new single, tour. And they're all using amphetamines at the minimum just to stay awake and keep to the next show, and probably lots of other stuff. It was just a toxic stew, and between the family commitments and the work commitments and his commitment to his own artistry and his development as a musician, something had to give. And Brian himself said the rubber band had stretched as far as it would go. And clearly, in the short term it worked. I'm sure 1965 was a much happier time for Brian than 1964 because he mostly got to stay home and create. And although the progression into drug use and mental illness certainly continued, he also got some peace, and he got to create, and he got to do some of his best work in 65. But it's worth mentioning that Brian did not leave right away. Now, he didn't tell the band he was leaving the touring band until the Beach Boys Today sessions. They thought he just was on a short break. When he told them, in Brian's words, I'd had my breakdown, now they had theirs. By all accounts, the band freaked out. Dennis was wanting to clear the room, or he'd throw an ashtray at them. Al Jardine apparently broke out crying or had stomach cramps. The one person that didn't lose his head was Carl. And this is another pivotal moment in Beach Boys history, because this is the point where Carl Wilson starts to assume ownership of the band. He was already almost certainly co-leader of the live band since the very beginning, for various reasons, particularly Brian's frequent absences. But now Carl would be the indisputed leader of the live band. He was the guy that visualized how the band could continue with Brian home and them continuing to tour. And Brian would continue to lead the band on an artistic level and continue to basically call the shots for another 3 or 4 years. But make no mistake, Carl's ascension to leadership of the band begins right here and would continue until his death in 1998. Interestingly, though, Brian did not completely stop playing live at this point. He actually returned to the road a little bit in '65 after the Today album was over. He was out for a couple of weeks in January and February. He was, including going back to Worcester. In fact, the last show that he did with the band as a regular touring member was in Worcester at the same place where the Riot had broken out. It's kind of interesting. And then he's out again. I don't think there's anything other than coincidence there, but it's kind of interesting. He also did a couple of shows in Chicago in March, where apparently they were doing another live album. I don't understand what that was about since they had just done one. And then he also played the Hollywood Bowl with them in July. So he did about a month's worth of stuff with them in '65. But after that, he was out. And the band went on a very radically new course. I mean, I don't think there was another band up to this point that had had a member leave the road like that. But once that precedent was established, you saw the Beatles leave the road in '66. You saw Bob Gaudio of the Four Seasons, who had kind of a Brian Wilson role in that band. He did the same thing Brian did. Stopped touring with the band, but continued to produce their records all the way up to the end. Once Brian had set this precedent, one of many Brian would set in his rather remarkable career. Other people went, this looks good, let's get off this treadmill. By having this breakdown and leaving the road and going home, you'd probably save Brian's life. But rather like things that would happen later in his life, the thing that saved his life would again threaten it, because the having so much mastery of his own time, having his world become smaller and smaller, and more centered around his own desires in his own room. As we know, for the band's history, that would create a bit of a feedback loop, along with the mental illness and the drug use, that would be very detrimental to Brian. So it's almost an echo of the Eugene Landy situation many years later, where Brian would have died without Landy's intervention, but then Landy's treatment almost killed Brian all over again. So it's this tragedy of Brian's life, where Brian needs a certain amount of freedom to do what he wants to do, but he also seems to need other people to catalyze and sort of motivate him forward, to not sort of get stuck in his own loop of his own mind, and to keep being directed. But this is the point where Brian, both as a full-time Beach Boy and also as somebody we would consider, God, I hate to say that, I don't want to use the word normal because that's so loaded. But Brian, up to this point, just was an eccentric, fun guy. And this is the first time we start to see, no, there's something really wrong here. But take away all the other stuff and look at the kind of stress this guy was under. And what he managed to endure in this year, in this 14 months of insane activity. Would I have lost my mind? Would I have started taking drugs? Would I have had an anxiety attack? Yeah, maybe. I'll see you on the next episode of Pet Squares. Again, if you enjoy these shows, please consider becoming a patron. And there's also, at the time of this filming, a fundraiser going on to keep the channel going. There's information about that in the first comment. And I'll see you on the next episode.